The mission of Flawless for me is about self-forgiveness. It's about self-compassion. And it's about getting that internal voice to match up with those external voices that are being much nicer when you're in your darkest moments. I have a really interesting beginning to my personal story. I grew up in Pennsylvania. That is not interesting. What is interesting is that I was actually born in Bethlehem and raised in Nazareth, Pennsylvania. I have to use the map because when I didn't use a map, people would get really angry and they'd be like, "That's not a funny joke, man. You're not mental health Jesus." And I was like, right, I never said that. These places exist. Nazareth doesn't have a hospital. If you're pregnant, the hospital is in Bethlehem. You have to have your child and then go back to Nazareth. The funniest part of this story is I'm about to tell you about a guy who was born in Bethlehem, raised in Nazareth, and went on to speak to millions of people with a message. Every mental health story begins with a family. This is mine. I am the little guy in yellow. I have two older brothers, Vance and Thad. This is a perfect 1980 photo. My dad's in a track jumpsuit. My mom has just let out her disco perm, and we are moving forward in life. But every story starts with a family because what this picture could never tell you is that on both sides of my family, we have massive amounts of depression, anxiety disorders, bipolar disorder, and addiction. This was not a question of if I was going to have a mental health disorder. It was which one was it going to be and when was it going to come out. And so I want to fast forward to age 11. This is me rocking a Jordan t-shirt. I'm dropping off my oldest brother at the University of Pennsylvania in his sophomore year of college. My middle brother is on the right side, the other guy. We dropped my brother off at the University of Pennsylvania that August. In October, my father received a phone call that said, "Your son was determined to be a threat to himself and others and was placed in a psychiatric ward. We hope you can come visit him." But this was just the start of a massive amount of change for me that I would experience over the next 2 years. I visited my brother in that psychiatric ward in October of that year. In January of the next year, my grandmother died. A year later, my grandfather died. And 6 months after that, my best friend was killed in a car accident. From age 11 to 13, I started going through this major amount of loss and change, and I didn't know what to do. I grew up in a family where emotions were never discussed or talked about, and so I hid it. I found it was much better to put a happy face on and make people laugh than to talk about it. And I found that drinking was a quicker way to cope with my pain than anything else. So by the time I got to be 16, a lot of things changed. It's okay to laugh at this picture. Who thought this guy would have trouble adjusting to high school, right? So a lot of things changed, but obviously what I was going through wasn't funny. At 16, I started experiencing clear symptoms of bipolar disorder. I had massive amounts of mania where I wouldn't sleep for 5 days in a row and felt invincible. Then I'd go into these deep depression where I couldn't get out of bed and I couldn't do anything. But because I had started drinking at 13, I started binge drinking at 16. And what I found was that binge drinking was a much quicker way to stop the thoughts, to slow them down, to pass out, and to sleep. When you drink as your coping mechanism, your symptoms don't get better. At 17, my diagnosis changed to bipolar disorder with anger control problems and psychotic features. I had massive outbursts of anger and severe hallucinations. When I went into my senior year of high school, I went into a horrible state of depression. It started off with loneliness. I didn't say anything. I thought the loneliness would go away. It led to thoughts of death and suicide 24 hours a day, 7 days a week for 2 months, but I didn't say a word. I thought that one day I'd wake up and I'd want to live again. I thought that one day I'd wake up and everything would magically get better. But that day didn't come. And on January 5th of my senior year, I was hospitalized for attempting to take my own life. When I got into that hospital a couple days later and finally figured out what had happened, I realized that I had this massive external life that everybody saw and an internal life that no one knew about. Because I wasn't on anyone's radar. I was president of my class and a varsity basketball player and involved in every student activity possible. Eventually, I got out of that hospital. I went back to high school, and I just wanted everything to be normal again. So when I graduated, I chose to go to American University in Washington, D.C. I thought my past would leave me, that I could start over and move on. 2 months into my freshman year, I had a massive relapse with bipolar disorder, and I had to go home. And I was hospitalized again. And then I was in and out of hospitals and colleges for the next 4 years. And then I had this genius idea that if I just went back to American, everything would get better. When I returned to American University 4 years after I started at age 22, not only were things not going to get better, but my coping mechanisms had gotten much worse. In November of that first semester back, one night I pre-gamed. I had about 13 shots of vodka in an hour, and then I went out. More shots, more beer. I passed out that night around 2 in the morning. When I woke up the next day, my clock said 12, but when I looked outside, it was dark. It wasn't noon of that day. It was midnight of the next day. I'd been passed out for 22 hours, and this was not uncommon for me. This had become the norm. So I woke up that night, I looked in the mirror, and I started crying. And I said to myself, all right, you're either going to continue this and you're going to die, or you're going to have to change. That was the first night that I actually accepted having bipolar disorder. From 13 to 22, I went through loss and hospitals and all kinds of things, and it wasn't until that moment that I accepted it. Acceptance is a big part of this. But I hated myself, and I hated myself more than I think anyone in this room could possibly imagine. And when you hate yourself, it doesn't matter what your diagnosis or treatment are. I didn't care enough about myself to even want to try and work on anything. There are few things more dangerous than a person who hates themselves. I had no consequences. So I went into therapy, I went into treatment, and I was honest for the first time, and I had to learn to like myself. And once I learned to like myself, I could deal with everything else. To do that, I put myself in a system where I got sleep, and I started working through therapy and finding a treatment that works best for me. But the most important lesson I learned in my recovery was that I never chose to have bipolar disorder, but I could choose to change the way I coped with it. I could start being honest, I could stop hiding, I could stop drinking, I could start talking and exercising and writing and building relationships that mattered. Eventually, I found a way to manage my bipolar disorder. I went on to graduate from American University. I went into a fancy life of mental health advocacy, but I still work on this every day. Every day I have to build my mental health and check in with myself and make sure I'm okay and that I can manage these situations. So that's my story with bipolar disorder, and now you're thinking, wait, that's like 6 minutes. That's only halfway. Having bipolar disorder doesn't make me unique or different. A lot of people have it. What made my story different is what happened to me when I was in high school. When I got out of the hospital after attempting to take my own life, I grew up in a really small town. The reaction was not kind. I lost friends. In school, I was called the crazy kid, the psycho. I had rumors about me all through that town. And 2 months after I got out of the hospital, a psychologist came into one of my classrooms to talk about the patients he was treating. As he talked about the patients he was treating, every single student in that classroom started laughing. But I wasn't laughing, because by that point, I had been laughed at too much. And so I grabbed my teacher and I took him into the hallway and I said, "This isn't funny to me." And he looked down at me in the most rural Pennsylvania way and he said, "What are you going to do about it? What are you going to do about it?" And I had no idea that the answer I was going to give was going to change my life forever. But I looked back up at him and I said, "Let me speak. Let me tell people what it's like to go through this." I stood up in that classroom 2 weeks later and I spoke for the very first time. And when I finished, no one laughed. And I learned at a young age that if you share your story, it opens people to sharing theirs. So from age 17 to age 22, I spoke to high school classrooms in my darkest years about what it was like to have bipolar disorder. When I turned 23 and was doing better in treatment, I had this idea: why wasn't this a full school assembly? Why didn't I hear about this in high school? So I created the Youth Mental Health Awareness Movement. It was a nonprofit organization to start full school assemblies about mental health. I ran it for a year. At age 24 in 2002, these guys approached me. Hey, it's those guys. This is a picture of the Clintons and the Gores at the first ever White House Conference on Mental Health in 1999. They started the National Mental Health Awareness Campaign at this conference. It was the first large-scale stigma reduction campaign in the country. In 2002, they came to me and said, "What's missing?" And I said, "We don't have large-scale assemblies about mental health." So I signed on as the director of outreach. And from 2002 to 2006, I spoke to over 500,000 young people in large-scale presentations. The goal was not to promote me. It was to figure out a system to train others so that we could have more diverse voices and get more people involved. In 2006, we created the first youth mental health speakers bureau in the country. In 2007, I wrote a book called Behind Happy Faces. By 2010, I had trained over 50 speakers and created this new movement of youth mental health speakers speaking to large audiences. And I burned out. And I did what anyone does when they burn out. I joined the Peace Corps. It's like, I'm so tired, I'm gonna go live in this hut. I lived in Botswana, and I worked at the largest center for people with disabilities in the country. My main job there was to do awareness for HIV and AIDS. I'd done 8 years of awareness for mental health. I was doing 2 years of awareness for HIV and AIDS, and the whole time that I was washing my clothes by hand and stepping away from leopards, I was thinking to myself, what's next? I came home in 2013, and this one statement stuck out to me. Nelson Mandela said, education is the most powerful weapon which you can use to change the world. So I asked myself again, what's missing? And what was missing was a mental health curriculum. We're not teaching people about mental health. So in 2013, I created the Behind Happy Faces mental health curriculum, and it's now being used by over 70,000 middle school, high school, and college students. Thank you. Thank you very much. It's being used in very unorthodox ways. It's being used in Greek life and freshman orientations. I have a partnership with the NCAA. It's being used by student athletes, but it's just the start. It's 4 lessons to teach you a definition of vocabulary, how to cope, and how to help a friend. We need to go further than that. We will always need awareness, but we need to do more. We need to teach mental health the same way we teach physical health, from kindergarten through the rest of your life. Mental health is not something you do when something's wrong. It's not something you do when you have a problem. Mental health is something you build and you foster and you grow, much like your physical health. That's the future I see. That's the future we need. That's the future I am working tirelessly to. Mental health needs to be taught. If we're going to see the perfection in people, they need to know their options. They need to know how to work on them. I didn't have the tools to do this when I was a teenager because no one talked about it. We need curriculum to give people those tools. And so I have one more story I'm going to share with you. When I turned 21, my parents took me out for my birthday dinner. It was a standard birthday dinner. We sit down at a steakhouse, we order appetizers, waiter walks away, and then my parents started crying. And I didn't see my dad cry a lot in my life, and so I looked at them and I was like, why are you guys crying? And my dad looked at me through those choking, balled up tears, and he said, we didn't think you would live to be 21. I gave my parents a lot of reasons to not think I would live to be 21, but I did. Unfortunately, I've met a lot of families who don't. If you have experienced loss with every cell in your body, then you have experienced love with every cell in your body. And you know that after a while, you can find some lightness through that dark. Today, you heard a lot of stories, including mine. This issue doesn't change unless you tell yours. This issue doesn't change unless we teach people about mental health in new ways, and that is art, and that is music, and history, and neuroscience, and everything coming together to make a difference. There is a massive amount of power in all of your stories. You won't know where it leads until you tell it. Thank you very much.